in the short run, equilibrium output or equilibrium GDP, or the level of GDP, is determined mainly by changes in aggregate demand or total demand. We decompose this aggregate demand or total demand into different components based on different economic agents. We explained how aggregate demand is consumption, what households spend on goods and services, plus what firms or businesses spend on investment. So when they're buying a new machine or buying a new house. We also added the government spending, setting the fiscal policy, which has two components: government spending on one side and taxes on the other side, and government transfers. G here, or government spending or the government sector, is one of the economic agents that interact in the market. The outside world, which mainly refers to exports and imports. Exports are more than imports, that means you have trade surplus. If exports are less than imports, then you have trade deficit. But then we just assume that we are in a closed economy where there is no exports or imports, or meaning exports equal imports equal zero. So just to make things simpler, so what we have discussed last time is mainly based on three sectors: households, firms, and government. We start looking at each one of those components, and we show some data from the United States and from the UK, and we show that consumption is probably the largest component in aggregate demand. We were interested to understand what determines these components, especially consumption, which will help us understand the equilibrium output or equilibrium GDP. So we started with the consumption function, and we show that the consumption function has two components. One, which is autonomous consumption. So autonomous means here it doesn't depend on income, and we call that C0, plus another component which mainly depends on disposable income, positively related to disposable income. And we explain disposable income here means income minus taxes and government transfers. So basically what is available to be spent on consumption or goods and services. A very important concept we looked at, which is the slope of the consumption function, is the marginal propensity to consume, which we call C1. And this is a very important concept, because if income increased by 100 million pounds and consumers or households spend 80 million out of this 100 million pound increase in income, if they spend that in consumption, that means the marginal propensity to consume is 80% or 0.8. How about the other part, which is what remains here, is 20 million pound? These basically go to savings. So which makes the marginal propensity to save 20%. So the sum of both, so they should add up to 100% or 1. Okay, marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save. We made some assumptions. We assumed that investment is exogenous. When we explain what we mean by an exogenous variable means it is not determined within the model, so you take it as given. We treated investment as exogenous. We treated also government spending as exogenous. So these two variables were exogenous. And also we made a very important assumption, which will lead us to the equilibrium condition. Firms hold no inventories. If firms hold no inventories, the output or the equilibrium output or the equilibrium condition will be when production equal demand or equal aggregate demand. Again, these are the components. We assume that aggregate demand equals C plus I plus G. These are the three sectors, because we assume that there is no outside world, or this is a closed economy. Could state the equilibrium condition as the relationship between investment and saving. And we show that you could reach the same equilibrium you see on the screen using stating the equilibrium condition as investment equal savings. This is what we reached here. So we have Y equal 1 over 1 minus C1. Again, C1 here is the marginal propensity to consume, so which is 1 over 1 minus C1 is the multiplier, and we explain what that means. And then the red part here is the autonomous spending. So again, which means this is part of demand that is not dependent on income. And the multipliers here, which is again, it's 1 over 1 minus C1. The size of this multiplier depends on the value of the marginal propensity to consume, which is C1. When C1 is closer to 1, obviously C1 cannot be more than 1, so it's between 0 and 1. So if you have C1 that is closer to 1, that means a larger size for the multiplier. And also that means it will take more rounds to adjust. So it will take longer time to adjust to, or more rounds of adjustment until we reach the equilibrium output. I explained last time by giving an example how much or how the adjustment work. We said if income increased by 100 million pounds and the marginal propensity to consume was 0.8, that makes the multiplier 5. That means the total effect is going to be 100 million pounds, the initial increase in whatever part of the autonomous spending, could be autonomous consumption, could be government spending. And actually that's very important because that's what the government control is, how much they spend. And as I said before that, explain the fiscal policy, what type of fiscal policy the government applies. It's basically because they can change government spending, they can change what they spend, and they can change taxes as well. So if we assume we have an expansionary fiscal policy, meaning that the government will spend more money. Spending more money, just remember G here, between brackets, means this is part of the autonomous spending. This initial increase was 100 million pound and the 0.8, that makes the multiplier 5, so that means the total effect on output should be 100 pound times 5, times the multiplier. This shows us different values for the marginal propensity to consume from 0.1 to 0.9 and how much the multiplier will be. And this is the initial increase in the government spending. So this is an expansionary fiscal policy by increasing G by 100 million pound in the first round. And this is how much the effect will be in the second round. So obviously, if the marginal propensity to consume was 90%, so that means people will spend 90% of this 100 pound on income. So that means income will increase by 90 pound, and that will go on because in the second round or in the following round, that means those who receive the 90 pound will spend 81 pound or save 9 pound, and that will carry on until this effect will disappear. And as you see here, so this is the sum of these rounds. So it's nearly 1,000 pound, which you could actually get this by just multiplying 10, which is the multiplier, times the initial amount, which is 100, rather than calculating this all these rounds until this even still hasn't been 0 now. So still there's some impact here. But if you carry on, this was nearly 1,000. Here was like 500 because the multiplier was 5. Again, because the marginal propensity to consume was 0.8. So that makes the multiplier 5. So if the initial increase was 100, so 100 times 5, that gives us 500. So you didn't need really to do all this calculation. So if you have a smaller marginal propensity to consume, that means you have a smaller multiplier, and obviously the effect will be small, or the total effect will be small as a result. We show how plot this to say the same thing using a graph. One thing I mentioned last time, which was the 45-degree line. So remember when we started to show the equilibrium on a graph, we showed that we had income in the horizontal axis and production and aggregate demand on the vertical axis. So one thing I said is the 45 degrees line show all the points where both whatever you measure on the horizontal axis and whatever you measure on the vertical axis are equal. Just I made up some numbers. So just income is 100, from 100 to 1,000, the same thing for production. And I just tried to plot this. This gives us exactly the 45 degrees